Okay, everyone. This is the second part of our look this week at the New Testament and Second Temple Judaism. So, in the previous lecture, I discussed the broader political um, events of the Greco-Roman period as they relate to Judea and the Jews, and by extension, anyone who came to be associated with Jesus, Paul, and later the early Christians. So, in this lecture, I want to spend a little bit of time looking at um, the various Jewish groups that we know of from the Second Temple period, and specifically in the New Testament, when we come across any reference to the Jews, what exactly do we mean by that? Um, do we have an idea of Judaism as a monolith, as one large thing, or are there multiple groups of Jews who are reacting to life under imperial Rome in different ways? So this will be a brief overview of four groups of Jews um, during this period. To start off with, I want to just talk a little bit about the Greek term that's used to translate, or that gets translated into either Jew or Jews, or Judean or Judeans. So the Greek word is Judaios or Judaioi, um, depending on your pronunciation. Those of you who took Greek, maybe you say Judaiou or something like that. At any rate, this word traditionally has been translated as Jew or Jews, or the plural Jews. But in recent times, there has been a practice to say, well, maybe this is a geographical reference, and Judaios or Judaioi is a reference to a Judean or Judeans, people who live in the region of Judea. So a political and geographic designation. The problem with this is that by saying that, you're erasing the Jewish identity from the people who live there, who are, historically speaking, predominantly, overwhelmingly Jewish in the way that we think about the religious and cultural aspects of Jewish identity. So Judean and Judean can be problematic, even though the attempt to use them was to combat anti-Judaism in the New Testament. Okay. The other option is to just leave it as Jew or Jews. Because the problem with using Jew with reference to religious or cultural aspects of identity, and then reserving the term Judean for geopolitical aspects of identity is anachronistic. Okay, when we think about our identities, we think about, well, I'm a Christian, I'm a Mennonite Christian, or I'm a Lutheran Christian, and then secondarily, I'm a U.S. citizen. We separate those things, but ancient people didn't do that. So it is we do it's inaccurate. We do, I don't want to say violence. We do not speak of ancient people in the most accurate sense when we try to separate those identities. So in the New Testament, yes, there are passages that are anti-Jewish in the way that they have been interpreted in Christian tradition, and that stems from ideas around Jew and Jews. But moving to a translation of Judean has its own problems. So, despite all of this, let's keep Jew and Jews as the way we translate these terms. And as a reminder, here's our timeline. Just recall that Jews have a long history here, extending back to the Persian Empire, and even before that, the Babylonians and Assyrians, a long history of imperial rule, with only this brief period of Jewish independence from 142 to 63. So just bear that in mind. Yeah, you as a people, think of your people living under imperial rule for centuries on end. I included a map this time, didn't have to add it in post-production. You can see there, that's the independent Jewish kingdom, the Hasmonean kingdom, between the Seleucids to the north and the Ptolemies to the south, in the broader context of what will become Roman Empire here. So geographically, just a reminder, we're talking the small piece of land we're talking about here. And let's just say, a good thing to keep in mind is the complex social, political, and religious context in Judea under Roman imperial rule facilitated the formation of diverse groups of Jews and Jewish identity, which is what we're going to look at now. So, what kind of groups do we have here in the Second Temple period? Okay, you all are probably familiar with the Pharisees, right? This group of Jews is associated with study houses and synagogues. They are thought to be a proto-rabbinic movement. So the rabbis that emerge after the fall of the temple, the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, and the early rabbinic tradition, the Mishnah and Talmud, it's believed that the rabbis are an extension of the Second Temple Pharisees. Pharisees place an emphasis on choice and human decision as a factor for interpreting and applying the law. And we'll see here and in a little bit how that contrasts with the Sadducees. The Sadducees are associated with the high priesthood, with the elites in Jerusalem. Everything in the world is natural for them, especially the priestly pedigree. You can imagine that, to be a priest, you have to be born into a line of priests. So you obviously think very highly of your place in society, and you are thankful that, there's a natural order to the world and that you somehow came out, in a privileged spot. Then we move from the center, sort of these, we move away from kind of the central, larger groups to more marginal and sectarian forms of Judaism. You have the Essenes, or we sometimes associate these with the Qumran sectarians. Qumran is the site where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. We'll talk about in a minute. This group of Jews concentrated in the Judean desert, right? They separated themselves from the Jerusalem temple establishment, and they lived in seclusion around the Dead Sea. Although most of the Dead Sea texts were found at Qumran, there by the Dead Sea, it's believed that this was a broader sectarian movement. And their ideology centered around a reformed vision of the priesthood. So the Essenes and the Sadducees are both priestly varieties of Judaism, but they have competing or conflicting interpretations of what that means, how the temple should be run, how the people who run the temple should comport themselves, and live their lives. But nonetheless, two competing versions of priestly Judaism. And then we have a fourth group, the Sicarii. These are literally, that means dagger men. These are a more violent variety of Judaism. They are anti-Roman rebels, right? Remember the imperial context. There are multiple ways you can respond to imperial rule. You can assimilate, you can creatively or peacefully resist, or you can flee, or you can take matters into your own hand and try to correct the situation with other like-minded revolutionaries. And it turns out the Sicarii are probably a fit into a broader movement of violent revolutionaries. So let's talk a little further about the Pharisees. The Jewish historian Josephus mentions that the Pharisees are precise in their application of Jewish law. And let's see, the etymology of the name Pharisee comes from the Hebrew word, or it's believed to come from parash, or the Aramaic parush, which means something like separate. So the Pharisees are separatists. They separate themselves from things that are impure, anything that's impure, food, or the tables of people who are not scrupulous about the purity laws and tithes at the temple. Okay, so that's kind of, they're separatists. However, let's see. Yeah, the Pharisees, Paul is associated with the Pharisees, Philippians 3:5. As to Paul, when he's talking about himself, as to the law, I was a Pharisee. So as we get in later in the semester, we're going to talk about Paul and, the very complicated nature of Paul and his writings. Paul being a Pharisee, did Paul convert from Judaism to Christianity? Or was Paul a Jew who accepted the proclamation that Jesus was the Messiah, which was incompatible with Pharisaic Judaism? Or is our conception of Pharisees through the lens of the New Testament historically inaccurate? These are the questions we have to wrestle with. The Pharisees, in terms of their social status, they live simply, Josephus writes, making no concessions to luxury. Josephus, in another section of his the Jewish Antiquities, writes that the Sadducees were able to persuade the rich, while the Pharisees, quote, have the multitude on their side. So the Pharisees are associated with the common people. Sure, they have a particular way of interpreting the law, and they want other people to interpret it that way. But by and large, they belong to a lower social stratum. Artisans, small farmers are associated with them and tend to gravitate toward them. And the Pharisees, again, not born into a priestly family, they excel at studying Torah and dedicating their lives to the study houses, and figuring out how to apply the law, figuring out how to apply Jewish law, Jewish teaching in ways that are practical in an everyday setting. And it's hard for us to wrap our heads around that because we're so used to thinking that the Pharisees are legalistic and that they want to make life difficult and rigid for people. But again, think of the context of Roman imperialism. If your imperial overlords are somewhat antagonistic toward your religious practices and beliefs, it would make sense that if you have a legal system that has enough flexibility in it where you can manipulate it to fit your particular setting, this is an attractive thing, and it's possibly a reason why the Pharisees, why the way that they approached the law carried over centuries later into rabbinic Judaism. In terms of in terms of their relation to Hellenistic culture, they were only moderately Hellenized. Sure, they accepted some Greek technical vocabulary here and there, and they partook in Hellenistic material culture because that's where you live. But by and large, were not influenced by Greek thought. Now, interestingly, the Pharisees have a number of beliefs that overlap with Jesus' own teaching. The immortality of the soul, belief in an afterlife, that's connected to reward and punishment, the belief in angels, and the hope for an imminent redemption, which sounds a lot like the breaking in or the coming of the kingdom of God. Okay, so broadly speaking, Lawrence Schiffman writes that Jesus' approach to ethics and his teachings of love are derived from and shared with Pharisaic teachings. Now, Jesus differed with the Pharisees on interpreting the law, but that's almost a rule of thumb for any Jewish group in the Second Temple period. Just like it's a rule of thumb that many Christian denominations, although they're all Christian, have minor and sometimes major differences in how they interpret the Bible and how they use it to do theology and to do ethics. So the Gospels set up Jesus to be in opposition to the Pharisees, when in fact, in terms of all the Jewish groups that are out there in the Second Temple period, Jesus and the Pharisees probably have more in common than we are led to believe in the sermons we've heard from our pastors growing up and in our Sunday school classes. So we have to be careful this is one thing I wanted to emphasize. The word Pharisee gets used in modern parlance to characterize people with whom we disagree, or to brand someone as a hypocrite. And this is, if you were to speak to any rabbis today or Jews today, which I attend a Jewish school. I'm doing my PhD at a Jewish school, so I'm around Jews all the time. And using the term Pharisee in a pejorative way is a microaggression in terms of being anti-Jewish. So I want to emphasize we need to stop using that term in a pejorative way to label people. This historical situation in Second Temple Judaism is much more complex than we're led to believe. And honestly, we can't take the New Testament at its face when we read about Jesus and the Pharisees, or Jesus and the scribes, Jesus and the Sadducees, teachers of the law, etc., right? There's a historical context that we need to understand here that might give a different picture of the situation. The Sadducees We can see in Acts 5:17, then the high priest took action, he and all who were with him. And then in quotes, that in parentheses, that is the sect of the Sadducees. Etymologically, Sadducee comes from the Hebrew word zadok, or some people might say Zadok, but Zadok is the priestly line, the priestly dynasty in the Old Testament. There's this term, when I was growing up, people would say, "Oh, the Sadducees, they don't believe in the resurrection, so they're sad." You see, this is another one of those things we need to stop saying that. The Sadducees didn't believe in resurrection because the priestly pedigree with which they were born does not apply to the soul. So naturally, you would not subscribe to a belief that equalized your status, or that removed your privileged status as a priest. So, the Sadducees had a real reason for not believing in the resurrection, just like other groups of Jews, like the Pharisees, had a reason for believing in the resurrection, or Jesus and his followers believed in the resurrection, in bodily resurrection. As I mentioned, the Sadducees and the Qumran sectarians, or the Essenes, are two denominations of priestly Judaism. I don't have much more to say about the Sadducees, and the reason for that is because there are a lot fewer writings about the Sadducees. They left behind no writings. So everything that we can say about them comes through the lens of other writers who are typically writing about them in negative ways. Okay, so we come now to the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Qumran sectarians. So I won't go into the whole story, but the caves around Qumran were excavated in, well, I shouldn't even say that, around 1947 to 1948. It's believed that a few Bedouin shepherds, stumbled into these caves and found fragments of scrolls, and they took them back. They sold them for money in Jerusalem. And it is a fact that fragments of these scrolls got out, and famously, there's like a New York Times, in like 1950, there's like a New York Times, a little ad that says, scroll from the Dead Sea, $50. So the caves were officially excavated between 1947 and 1956, and all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, they didn't end up being published and available for research until the early 90s. So it's an interesting story about the politics of archaeology, and different political entities being involved in finding, the greatest archaeological discovery, textual discovery, really, of the 20th century. So it's a broader sectarian movement, not just around the site of Qumran, but various other caves and settlements, notably Masada. There were sectarian scrolls discovered there. Here's a picture of some other caves. You can see Qumran on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea, but you can see, you go down from there, Wadi Marabaat, okay, there were scrolls found there. Go down even farther, Nahal Haver, Nahal Se'elim. All of these other places, there are other similar writings found. Just in terms of the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are 930 scrolls or text. A lot of these are fragmented, so really there's thousands of fragments, but 930 texts. About 220 of them are biblical, so only 25%. When you hear people make the claims that The Dead Sea Scrolls prove that the Bible, as we have it, that every word is. I can't move this. That every word that the Bible is completely true based on the fact that Qumran contains biblical text. The problem with that claim is that the majority of texts at Qumran are non-biblical, and actually many of them are texts that didn't make it into our Bible. You know, if you recall our discussion of canon last week. And then notably, there's no text of Esther that was found at Qumran. So that claim is probably not a good claim to advance. The significance for studying the Dead Sea Scrolls for early Christianity can be illustrated this way. And actually, one of my teachers, John Campen, who is a graduate of AMBS, like back in the 80s, late 70s, early 80s. He's a wonderful Dead Sea Scrolls scholar and also a scholar on the Gospel of Matthew. He gave this illustration, which he drew on the board in a very scribbled way, and I'm putting it in this presentation. So you think about the literature of the Greco-Roman world represented in this circle here. And then think about a smaller portion of that being the Jewish literature of the time. And then you think of an even smaller section of Jewish literature represented by the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay. Now, another corpus of literature that somewhat resembles this group happens to be the early Christian writings or the New Testament. So in the context of Jewish literature and in the context of the literature of the Greco-Roman world, the Dead Sea Scrolls are the closest thing that we have to the New Testament. So that's why it's significant in the field of New Testament studies. I'm gonna skip this for now. You have the slide here. Yeah, these are quotes from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Let's see. Yeah, a comparison of Old Testament books quoted in the Dead Sea Scrolls compared to the New Testament, and you can see similarities across there. So talking about that similarity between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the New Testament. All right, so the fourth movement, we mentioned the Sicarii. These are the dagger men. They start out, there's a direct reference to them in Acts 21:37 to 38. Just as Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the tribune, "May I say something to you?" The tribune replied, "Do you know Greek? Then you are not the Egyptian who recently stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 assassins out into the wilderness." So the Sicarii, Josephus writes that they records that they are the ones who took a stand on Masada during the Jewish revolt, the War of 66 to 70. But they have a history prior, and that's about the end of the Sicarii, the last stand on Masada. Prior to that, they were known as assassins, who would, if there was a festival going on in Jerusalem, they would have targets that they would go in and they would assassinate people connected to the Roman governing apparatus. The Romans really cracked down on this, and eventually the Sicarii become more sophisticated in their methods. They moved from assassinating people to planning kidnappings so that they could then make hostage demands or make demands in exchange for hostages. Yeah. these are the uncompromising nationalists who are devoted to the Holy Land, and they want to see the land purified of foreign influence. So, as people who subscribe to the peace tradition, we recognize on the one hand that this is not the way that we would resolve this conflict, nor do we, as followers of Jesus, believe that this is the way to solve a conflict. But at the same time, we have to think about it even through a colonialist lens. Think about what life is like under a colonizer, under an imperial presence, and what lengths do you go to redeem your identity, to recover your identity, your sense of autonomy? Is that possible? And so just to consider the political and the social context. But this is the fourth movement in Judaism. So Judaism in Jesus's day and beyond, we should really think about it as Judaisms, right? The plurality. It's dynamic and adaptive, sometimes not, but dynamic and adaptive to Greek and Roman culture. I have here on the screen some pictures of the synagogue in Sepphoris. Sepphoris is in Galilee, and it was a major intellectual center. Although it's not referenced in the Gospel, the likelihood that it's very likely that Jesus would have passed through Sepphoris in his ministry, or spent time in Sepphoris at the study houses. On the top right, you can see that now this is on the floor of the synagogue right? The place where Jews gather to read and hear the scriptures and pray. This mosaic, this wonderful mosaic on the floor of the synagogue has Helios, the sun god. And then on the bottom right, in another section of the floor, you have the zodiac, but with Jewish imagery and Hebrew text in it. So when you think about, they took this Greek art, these Greek icons, and they adapted it to their synagogue to beautify the space. And so just to think about, you've got the Sicarii on one side who want nothing to do with the Romans, with Hellenic ideas. Then you have Jews on the other hand who are willing to adapt and figure out how to make Judaism work within their context. We need to remember that there are nearly 4 to 7 decades between Jesus's death and the composition of the Gospels. So when we come across these problematic texts in the New Testament that speak pejoratively of the Pharisees and other Jewish groups, we need to remember that it's a possibility, a very likely possibility, that's a post-crucifixion, post-resurrection rereading, retrojection onto Jesus's time. So bear that in mind. Jesus and the Pharisees, and by extension the scribes, the elders, teacher of the law, etc., are portrayed as enemies in the Gospels. New Testament scholar Mark Allen Powell has this line from his New Testament introduction where he says, "Every story needs a villain." So whether or not Jesus and the Pharisees were really, enemies, or whether they disagreed on everything, which from a historical lens they didn't, they had a lot in common. We need to remember that the gospel writers are writing a story, and we have to take into consideration who the authors of the text are and who their audience is and what their aims might be. If you are one Jewish group trying to persuade people to join your movement, then of course you're going to go after the group that has the most similarities to you. In order to, bolster your own possibilities of gaining more followers. So, and then we always have to ask ourselves, is the gospel's portrayal of the Pharisees historically accurate? It's a complicated question. I do not have a definitive answer. I lean towards saying no, but on the other hand, it is a historical witness. We need to take it into consideration alongside other texts from Josephus, later from the rabbis, and taking into consideration this whole context of a diverse Judaism in the Second Temple period. Okay, so that's all for this week on the Greco-Roman period and the Second Temple Jewish context of the New Testament. As always, if there are questions, if I have used terms or phrases that you are like, I don't know what that is, please tell me more about that. Send it to me in an email. I'm here to help. Yeah, best of luck and peace to you all.